Alright, so we're going to kick off a new series. I know I've been uploading a lot of bowling and sports stuff, but this is kind of the reason I really made the channel. And again, I don't care if nobody sees this. This is just kind of for me, just kind of a hobby to talk about some movies and some horror stuff going on. So I want to kick off a new series where I'm going to rank the top 10 films from every decade from 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s. We're going to rank the top 10 horror films of those decades. But first of all, we need to touch on pre-1950. This is going to include a lot of the classic monsters, a lot of the classic stories. A lot of these are based on or adapted from classic books, famous books, and they gave us a lot of the kind of the horror icons that we know today when we think of horror. And then obviously in the ensuing decades, they've been reimagined and reworked and updated with kind of modern themes and modern effects and whatnot. So yeah, let's get this kicked off. Pre-1950, so everything up until 1950 is going to be included in today's ranking. And we're going to start off, because it is such a long timeline, there's a lot of years there to cover. We're going to start off with 5 honorable mentions. And first off, I want to just give a disclaimer. I have not seen all of these films. I have seen every film in the top 10, but I have not seen some of the honorable mentions. So just based on doing some research and looking up kind of rankings and listings of some of these classic films, some of these honorable mentions I have not seen, but I'm going to kind of honor them by putting them in the honorable mention category. So first up, we have M from 1931, which is a German film centered around a serial killer. Very atmospheric. This was a very turbulent time in German history. It's a very important film. So our first honorable mention is the movie M from 1931. Next honorable mention is the Phantom Carriage from 1921. This came up on many of the lists and rankings that I looked up when I did some research for this ranking. So this is a very classic kind of just ghost story, ghost tale of a carriage, and there's something spooky and mysterious going on with it. I have not seen this film, so I couldn't tell you everything, but that is going to be another one of our honorable mentions. Next up, from 1920, we have the Golem, or the Golem. I'm not quite sure how they pronounce that. Have not seen this film. It's immediately on my list now. This was actually ranked number 1 or number 2 in a lot of the rankings that I saw for films from the 1920s or classic or first kind of era of horror films. So this is the Golem coming in at one of our honorable mentions. Next up, from 1928, The Man Who Laughs. There's some debate whether this is a horror film. However, this one has quite a bit of carryover with a very pretty modern and very well-known character in the DC universe, the Joker, which we all know and love. So The Man Who Laughs is a film about a lonely, down on his luck man who is ultimately disfigured, and he has a permanent smile on his face. And again, I have not seen this film, but I do need to see it. I plan on doing so. And this, again, inspired the character of the Joker from the Batman universe. So very important, very iconic, and I need to see this one as soon as possible. Our last honorable mention here is a film in its original version that very few people got a chance to see, and that film is London After Midnight. So this is, along with The Man Who Laughs, this is another film which has a very iconic character. I think that almost kind of overarches or kind of dominates the movie to a degree. So This film stars Lon Chaney, and the look of the man in the beaver hat, he's called, very creepy, very iconic, very spooky, very early horror film. I'm giving this an honorable mention. I have not seen it. The reason why it is no longer available in its original form is because the original film reel was lost in a fire in, I believe, the 1960s. I believe it was Paramount Studios had a fire in like 1962, and a bunch of old film reels and movies were lost at that time, and this happened to be one of them. They have a restored version that you can watch where they're using stills and other kind of reworked images and clips to sort of reconstruct the film. But it's a shame that we can't actually watch it in its original version. Again, London After Midnight, extremely iconic villain, the man in the beaver hat. If you don't know, look it up. I'm sure you'll recognize it. Okay, so let's get into our top 10 here. A lot of classic monsters, a lot of classic creatures. This was a very interesting era and a very important era in horror. Without many of these films, the film and movie industry would look very different today. There would be, not necessarily as many, character actors and icons, and when you Google the term horror, a lot of these characters and monsters and individuals are going to show up as an image when you just search horror, which in itself is extremely iconic. All right, so kicking us off, let's see here. We have The Invisible Man. This is actually a top 12, I'm sorry. So we have 5 honorable mentions, and then we have a top 12. So coming in at number 12 is The Invisible Man from 1933. This is a film I have seen. Very good, very ahead of its time, I would say. So this is, a classic story. This individual is playing around with chemicals and is able to disguise his body, right? His skin turns invisible, and he's able to do some pretty nasty and horrific things. By today's standards, this is a very tame, not extremely horrific or grotesque film, but in 1933, this is really revolutionary, and the Invisible Man remains a very iconic character, I'll say. I won't say monster, but character. All right, number 11. This is a true horror icon. The film itself is number 11. And I didn't love the film as much as some others above it. Coming in at number 11 is The Mummy from 1932. Boris Karloff stars as the Mummy, Imhotep, and just this film all around is very iconic. The story is very of its time, right? Searching, Egyptian caves and pyramids and burial sites, and stumbling upon the grave of Imhotep, and that kind of kicks the film off, and then sort of mysterious happenings from there. Again, is this a great film? Debatable. The reason it's in my top 12 here, the Mummy is an iconic character, is an iconic universal classic monster, still resonates to this day. Many remakes and sequels have come from this film. It's a very iconic film, and that's why it's number 11. Coming in at number 10, perhaps the first very iconic kind of classic monster film. The second, and we'll get to the first later on in this ranking. Coming in at number 10, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. 1923, Lon Chaney again stars as Quasimodo, the Hunchback. This is a very different Hunchback than the Disney version that we would get in, I believe it was the 90s. It was either late 80s or early 90s. We got the Hunchback of Notre Dame from Disney. A lot of kids and a lot of people are aware of that film. they may not be aware of the original kind of idea or story of the Hunchback of Notre Dame, which is much more of a tragedy. And Quasimodo is not only a tragic figure, but a very grotesque and kind of shocking monster, so to speak. So yeah, coming in number 10, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Number 9, this one actually involves two very iconic classic monsters, Bride of Frankenstein. Some people rank this above the original Frankenstein film. I do not. My personal opinion on this film is it's pretty good. It has some, kind of updated themes and ideas over the original Frankenstein film. But to be honest, is it a better film? In my opinion, no. Bride of Frankenstein is very iconic. She's still, emulated, and people dress up as Bride for Halloween all the time. This day, up to this day, almost 100 years later. So coming in at number 9 is Bride of Frankenstein. Coming in at number 8, The Wolfman. Lon Chaney Jr. this time stars as the Wolfman. This is a very classic story. You have a man who is experiencing some strange things going on at night. He begins to wonder, am I to blame for some of these murders and, some of these things that are happening at night, especially around a full moon, because he will wake up and, be confused and delirious and various states of undress. He begins to suspect himself, and this is just again, universal classic monster, the Wolfman. This is a great story. Again, another tragic tale from 1941. So that's number 8, the Wolfman. Number 7 on this ranking, Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde from 1931. This story has been adapted to the big screen many, many times. In my opinion, this is probably the best adaptation of the bunch. This is a story we all are very familiar with. There is a Dr. Jekyll who, by day, is a pretty well-respected doctor, and he begins to experiment with some drugs and medicines that ultimately lead him to transform at nighttime into Mr. Hyde, which is a large, bumbling, murderous, kind of vicious version of himself. So again, coming in at number 7, a very classic tale, one of my favorites, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Alright, number 6 here, widely considered potentially the first horror film ever made. This comes out of Germany, I believe. Cabinet of Dr Caligari. I believe it comes out of Germany. Don't quote me on that. The Cabinet of Dr Caligari from 1920. Again, this isn't necessarily a film by today's standards that would be considered thrilling or horrific or shocking necessarily. But if you've seen it, it definitely has an impact. It definitely deserves to be respected and deserves to be included in many of these classic horror rankings. I don't want to necessarily give away the premise. There's an individual named Caesar who kind of is a henchman for Dr. Caligari, and he does very, kind of nasty and grotesque things. Not necessarily all shown on film, but this is a film where the imagination and the suspense, and honestly, some of your reaction is based on the reaction of some of the people and the crowds in the film. Their shock and disbelief kind of leads to your shock and disbelief. So yeah, Cabinet of Dr. Caligari from 1920, very iconic, widely considered the first horror film. From 1931, coming in at number 5, we have Frankenstein. Classic tale, mad scientist plays around, creates an undead giant lumbering monster that again is a very tragic tale. This monster doesn't necessarily want to hurt people or kill people or be causing problems, but because of the way he looks and because of his strength that he sometimes doesn't realize, he ends up being a target for an angry mob. And yeah, this is one of the best horror films ever made. Again, 1931. At the time, it was very, very thrilling and very iconic. Frankenstein, again, one of the Universal classic monsters, remains one of the, if not the most iconic monster to this day. When you think of Halloween or horror, what pops up, Frankenstein's always in the conversation. And I prefer this film over Bride of Frankenstein. I think this film is just better paced. I think the script is better. I think the story overall is better. We're able to focus on one creature and really kind of learn his tragic fate and follow him along. And you find yourself, maybe it's unlikely that any of you will be watching it for the first time, but if you know anyone or you have anyone that hasn't seen this, watch it for the first time with them, and then ask them, are you rooting for Frankenstein or are you rooting for mankind, because you're kind of caught in the middle. So Frankenstein comes in at number 5. All right, number 4. This film is debatable as a horror film, but it is widely considered one of the best classic horror films, and it spawned one of the most iconic monsters of a generation that we can still see appearing in films to this day, and that is King Kong. A really solid movie. Obviously, we all know it. We follow this research team that travels to this remote island in the Pacific to investigate some strange happenings and reports, and they end up encountering this giant ape called King Kong. And how they got this, I think at the time he was considered to be around 30 feet, 25 feet, 30 feet, somewhere in that range. How they physically transported him onto a ship and then sailed across the world back to New York, I have no idea. But that's what happens. They capture this giant ape, and they transport him all the way back to New York City, where he is, a bull in the china shop. He doesn't like all these people scurrying around at his feet and flashing photographs of him, and he just wants to get out of there and get back home. It's kind of another tragic tale, maybe the most classic tragic tale. He ends up at the top of the Empire State Building, battling. These planes are diving at him, and he ends up falling and dying. Again, it's one of the first true adaptations of man versus beast, and it is one of the best. So coming in at number 4 from 1933, King Kong. I will mention that it is shot in stop motion, which is extremely time consuming, and it is an extremely specialized skill. So that is another reason why it is widely considered one of the most iconic films. It is completed in stop motion, which is a very difficult way to shoot a film. And then another film coming up in our next ranking had the idea of shooting in stop motion, but ultimately due to time constraints and budget, they were not able to do that. And that in itself spawned another version of shooting a giant monster movie. And it's just interesting that this kind of spawned the whole stop motion craze. Yes, there was The Lost World, which I believe predates King Kong, but this kind of brought it to the mainstream more so than The Lost World did. Okay, top three here. These three were tough, particularly the top two, to rank and to decide which deserves to be number one. But here we go. Coming in at number three, we have The Phantom of the Opera from 1925. We have Lon Chaney playing the Phantom, obviously, right? We all know the story. Very tragic man versus monster to a degree. Not a full, transformation into a monster necessarily, but we have a disfigured man who haunts a Paris opera house and is taken by a young singer who performs in the opera there at the opera house. He falls for her. Initially, she is obviously not particularly taken, by him. She's not immediately attracted or fall in love with him. But eventually, they build a relationship, and it's an interesting dive into when two people are in love, even if it begins maybe with false pretenses, right? Where one of the individuals kind of asserts themselves into the situation, maybe where they shouldn't, or where they have kind of overstepped their bounds a little bit. Eventually, if the two individuals both fall in love and want to be together, we see it again and again in films. Other people get in the way. They don't want it to happen. They're horrified by it, and they get involved, and they get between them. So classic tale, Phantom of the Opera. I actually had the opportunity to go to the opera house that this book and then eventually these films and plays are based on in Paris. That was really cool. Phantom of the Opera coming in at number 3 from 1925. Coming in at number 2 from 1931, and again 1 and 2 are very tough. Very different versions of essentially the same type of monster or beast. Coming in at number 2 from 1931, we have Dracula. Bela Lugosi plays Count Dracula. We all know the story. We've all read the book by Bram Stoker. This was a very macabre take on the book. Very, very classic film, classic story. A lot of iconic lines come from this movie. It is widely considered, if not the number one, but definitely top 5 horror films of all time. If not of all time, then definitely of the classic era. So coming in at number 2, Bela Lugosi is Dracula from 1931. And this could have easily been number 1, but I felt that the film number 1 was a little bit more iconic, a little bit more horrific, and you just associate a little bit more with horror if you are kind of in the horror community, and if you are somebody who's interested in studies classic film. So coming in at number 1 from 1922, Nosferatu. Max Schreck plays Count Orlok, which is a very spindly, almost rat-like take on a vampire, right? And this film spawned a lot of iconic scenes and stills, and the image of his shadow with the long nails is iconic. Again, this took the #1 spot because when you Google horror, or you look horror up in a book, if you're if you're looking up horror in a dictionary or something, horror movies, this is almost always right there, #1. Count Orlok is a very shocking uh, creature. It's a very disturbing almost depiction of a vampire, and that's why it overtook Dracula at #1. This is a silent film, which you think, well, maybe how can it be that great? It's a silent film. Imagination has not. Well, let me just say this: imagination 100 years ago is a lot different than it is today. Today, we have kind of everything spelled out for us. We have everything explained, and there's lots of dialogue, and everything is just sort of laid out in front of us. Usually, unfortunately, movie trailers usually give away a lot of the main plot points and a lot of the juice. Some even plot twists and main themes are given away in the trailer just to get us interested to go buy a ticket and go watch it. But that wasn't necessarily the case 100 years ago. So if you imagine yourself sitting down in a theater, all you know about it is a film called Nosferatu. It's a silent film. You may not even have known it necessarily was a horror film. And the term horror film didn't really even exist at the time, because this was the first examples of a horror film, right? Dr. Caligari came out in 1920. This was just 2 years later, and this was a German silent film. So you can imagine yourself. Let's fast forward 100 years. You hear of a film called Terrifier, and oh, it's a great movie. There's this clown, and there's a great plot line with the family, and they're terrorized by this clown, and so you get a general idea of what it might be, but you haven't seen a trailer. Nobody has seen it because it hasn't premiered yet. So you go to the premiere for Terrifier, thinking that it might be a little scary or whatever. You imagine yourself watching a Terrifier film, not knowing what you're getting into. And again, I know Terrifier's 100 times more gory and gruesome than anything from the 1920s, but I'm just trying to make a comparison there. You'd be shocked, you'd be disturbed, you'd be horrified, and that's what audiences were in 1922 with Nosferatu. Count Orlok remains probably the most iconic image of horror to this day. So yeah, there is the top 12 films, horror films pre-1950, plus 5 honorable mentions. And as I said, I need to watch some of these that I haven't seen yet. And as I do watch some of these older films that I haven't seen, maybe my rankings will change. Maybe I'll be adding a few films here or there. But yeah, there is my ranking of classic horror films. So I hope you guys enjoy, and we'll see you for the top 10 horror films of the 1950s in the next episode. All right, peace.